Colonel Amina Brooks had faced mortar fire, war zones, and negotiations with hostile regimes, but nothing prepared her for the sting of injustice on a quiet street in Washington, D.C. It was supposed to be a simple morning. She'd just returned from a classified operation overseas and stopped at a corner cafe to grab coffee before heading to her Pentagon debrief. Stepping out of her government-issued sedan, she noticed two patrol officers watching her too closely. Their gaze wasn't about security, it was suspicion. One muttered something into his radio. The other eyed her uniformless figure, hand hovering near his holster. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," came the sharp order. Amina raised a brow. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You fit a description," he snapped. "Hands where I can see them." Confused but composed, she complied. Then, without warning, cold steel locked around her wrists. The handcuffs bit into her skin. Gasps from bystanders broke the morning calm. Her spine remained straight, chin lifted. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She just stared at them with the calm fury of a woman who had commanded troops, and now stood wrongly accused, not on foreign soil, but on her own. The cuffs clicked shut with a sound that echoed louder in Amina Brooks' mind than any battlefield explosion ever had. This wasn't combat. This wasn't hostile territory. This was home. And yet here she was, face pressed against the warm hood of a patrol car, arms pinned behind her back by two officers who had no idea who they were dealing with. "You're resisting arrest," one of them barked, though she hadn't moved an inch. "Arrest for what?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut steel. The taller officer sneered. "Suspicious vehicle. Matched a recent BOLO. Amina's eyes flicked toward the luxury black sedan she had parked perfectly within the lines. It still bore the duty parking permit on the windshield. She had returned from war zones more welcome than she was being treated on this American street. Around them, pedestrians had stopped to watch, some recording. One woman looked horrified. A man shook his head, muttering, "They don't even know." They didn't. Amina had spent 23 years in the U.S. military, rising through the ranks with quiet determination and unmatched intelligence. She wasn't just respected, she was feared on battlefields and revered in strategy rooms. Her recent deployment had involved a classified NATO summit in hostile territory. And now she was being shoved into the back of a police cruiser like a common criminal because she had brown skin and drove a nice car. The shorter officer leaned in, lips curling smugly. "You talk too much. You people always do." You people. That phrase, more than the cuffs, lit the fire in her blood. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. Not for fear, for restraint. Every instinct in her body screamed for action. But Colonel Amina Brooks didn't act out. She executed, with purpose, with precision. "I need to make one call," she said evenly. The taller officer laughed. "Not happening. You'll get your one call at the station." Amina turned her head slightly. "Then someone else will make it for me." She caught the eye of the woman across the street, the same horrified one with a phone still in hand. "Miss," Amina said, voice suddenly louder, more commanding. "Dial this. Say exactly what I tell you." The woman hesitated, then nodded. 202-555-0471. Say it's Colonel Brooks. Confirm priority code Red Tango 7. Repeat it exactly. The woman began dialing. The taller cop snapped, "Put that phone down," and took a step forward. But the moment he did, the woman's phone connected. "Pentagon secure line," a deep voice answered. The cops froze. Amina's lips barely moved. "This is Colonel Amina Brooks. Badge numbers 8472 and 5193 have unlawfully detained me. I require immediate verification of their authority." There was silence, then static, then chaos. Over the police radio, an urgent voice crackled to life. "All units, stand down." "I repeat, stand down." The cruiser door was flung open. Another officer ran up, face pale. "What the hell have you done?" he barked at the two men. "You cuffed a Pentagon-level officer?" Amina stepped out slowly, dusting off her sleeves. Her gaze didn't shake. Her poise didn't falter. The cuffs were removed with trembling hands. We didn't know," one officer stammered, sweat beading his forehead. "That," Amina said coolly, "is the problem." She turned back to the woman with the phone. Thank you, she said, voice softer now. You may have just saved their careers from turning into prison records. Then she lifted the phone again and dialed one final number. Secretary Ellison, yes. I want every stop those two officers have made in the past 5 years audited. Pull every complaint, every camera feed. We're cleaning house. And with that, she walked away. Not in handcuffs, but with the quiet, unshakable force of someone who knew her worth and was done letting others question it. Colonel Amina Brooks didn't look back as she walked toward her vehicle. A symbol now, not just of rank, but of restraint. Her military-issued sedan shimmered beneath the late morning sun, reflecting the shocked faces of the officers behind her, still frozen in place, still trying to compute what had just happened. She opened the driver's door with calm hands, slid in, and took a deep breath. Her fingers hovered over the screen of the encrypted government phone she carried in a sealed pouch. Standard for officers of her clearance, then with the same precision she once used to call in airstrikes, she made the call that would change everything. Colonel Brooks, came the clipped voice of Secretary Ellison as the secure line opened. I've been briefed. Are you physically harmed? No, Amina replied, her voice like polished stone. But two officers unlawfully detained me on U.S. soil. I want a full review. Immediate. Badge numbers 8472 and 5193. There was a pause. Consider it done, Ellison said, the steel in his voice matching hers. The call ended, but the consequences had only just begun. As Amina placed the phone down, she noticed the ripple effect already taking shape. Squad cars began pulling up around the block, not in defense of the arrest, but in rapid response to the escalating situation. Officers of higher ranks stepped out, their expressions a cocktail of disbelief and dread. One of them, a captain, jogged toward her, breath short, posture stiff. Colonel Brooks, please accept my sincerest apologies. We had no idea. You had no protocol, she interrupted, stepping away from her car. That's more dangerous than ignorance. The captain nodded solemnly, then turned toward his subordinates. Officers Henderson and Riley, hand over your weapons and badges. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty pending investigation. The two officers, Henderson, the smug one, and Riley, the silent follower, looked like they'd been punched in the gut. The gravity of their mistake finally settled in. We didn't know, Riley said again, more to himself than to anyone else. Amina's eyes met his. You saw my skin, not my status, and that tells me everything. Meanwhile, across the country, phones inside the Department of Justice and Internal Affairs were lighting up. The Pentagon had flagged the incident as a national priority. That wasn't just an internal matter anymore. It was a political firestorm waiting to erupt. Within hours, security footage was being pulled. Civil rights attorneys were already drafting statements, and media outlets were catching wind of a story that would rock the very foundation of law enforcement accountability. By sundown, Henderson and Riley were under suspension, stripped of privileges, facing internal charges for misconduct, racial profiling, and obstruction of justice. But for Amina, this wasn't about revenge. It was about recalibration, about showing the system that even its smallest cogs would be held to the highest standards. That evening, she sat alone in her apartment overlooking the Potomac River. Her uniform hung neatly inside her closet, metals gleaming softly in the overhead light. She didn't need them to feel strong, not anymore. The news blared from the muted television. A headline scrolled across the screen. Black military officer detained by police. Pentagon responds with zero tolerance. Amina took a sip of tea, her hand steady. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. But her eyes shone with something deeper than triumph. Justice. Earned, not granted. Because today she hadn't just defended herself. She'd drawn a line in concrete. The next morning, Colonel Amina Brooks woke to the sound of her phone buzzing nonstop. Not the secure Pentagon line. That had been handled. These were civilian notifications, news outlets, reporters, civil rights leaders, even military peers who hadn't spoken to her in years. Her name was everywhere. She sat at the edge of her bed, phone in hand, eyes catching the bold text flashing across the screen. Decorated black colonel wrongfully detained. Officers suspended after Pentagon intervention. Beneath the headline was a still image, her face calm, proud, and unshaken as the cuffs were removed. The camera had captured more than a moment. It had captured a reckoning. The footage had gone viral overnight. Social media was ablaze. Hashtags trended globally. Near Colonel Brooks, Mashunman, justice in uniform. Writer, cuffed but not silenced people weren't just outraged. They were inspired. Thousands commented about their own experiences with profiling, their frustration with silence, and their admiration for how she stood tall. Never yelling, never panicking, but commanding with nothing more than her voice. By 9 a.m., she was sitting across from a panel of Pentagon brass, intelligence advisors, and legal counsel. The room was silent as the video played again. The moment the officer smirked, the woman dialing the Pentagon, the stammering panic as Amina announced her rank and demanded accountability. When the video ended, no one spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then General Armand leaned forward. "Colonel Brooks, your composure under pressure was extraordinary. But what happened to you is unacceptable. I've already spoken with the Secretary of Defense. We're launching a federal review into law enforcement's interaction with high-ranking military personnel, particularly women and minorities." Amina gave a small nod. "Good, but don't just stop with the military. This is bigger than me. It's about every person who gets profiled walking down their own street." The next 48 hours moved fast. The Department of Justice announced an official investigation into the precinct involved. Civil rights organizations called for broader accountability. Officers Henderson and Riley were placed under internal affairs review, and several past complaints against them were suddenly pulled out of storage. Complaints that had mysteriously gone ignored. Now, under the spotlight, nothing could be swept away. Outside the D.C. courthouse, protesters gathered not in chaos but solidarity. Veterans stood side by side with civilians, holding signs that read, "Her rank was ignored, but her voice wasn't. No uniform required for respect." But it wasn't just about protest. It was about proof. Change was possible, and it had a face now. Colonel Brooks was invited to appear on national television. She declined the morning shows and political panels. Instead, she made one appearance. A live town hall streamed from the Lincoln Memorial. She stood beneath the towering marble statue, looking into the eyes of the crowd. "I didn't speak up just for myself," she said, voice steady. "I spoke up because every time we don't, it happens again. I was lucky. I had a title, a connection. But what if I didn't? What if I was just another woman in a car? Would anyone have listened?" The silence that followed her question wasn't emptiness. It was realization. When she stepped down from the podium, a young girl reached out from the crowd, clutching her mother's hand. "You're a real-life hero," the girl whispered. Amina crouched, met her eyes. "No, sweetheart. I'm just a soldier who refused to be silent." And in that moment, with the world watching, justice in motion, and a new conversation sparked, she became more than a name in a headline. She became a turning point. Weeks passed, but the ripple effect of Colonel Amina Brooks's stand had only just begun. The video of her unlawful detainment was no longer just a trending moment. It had evolved into a symbol. News cycles continued to air her town hall speech beneath the Lincoln Memorial, and across the country, reform meetings and legal reviews were launched using her case as a catalyst. Meanwhile, in a small, closed-door courtroom in Washington, D.C., former officers Henderson and Riley sat across from a panel of investigators and attorneys. Both looked drastically different from the confident men who had once smirked as they caged a decorated officer in steel. Henderson, now pale and fidgeting, wore a borrowed suit. Riley, once silent and complicit, looked down as an internal affairs agent read from a thick stack of complaints that had previously gone missing. Each page told a story. Names of individuals unlawfully stopped, reports buried under the weight of bureaucracy and bias. But with Amina's case dragging every dark thread into the light, there was no hiding left. The department had been forced to open its books, and the contents were damning. They weren't the only ones under fire. The police chief who tried to bury the incident the night it happened was forced into early retirement after leaked emails revealed he had tried to handle the Brooks matter quietly. Several officers from the same precinct were placed under formal review, and new sensitivity and authority verification protocols were introduced citywide. For the first time in department history, a civilian oversight board, majority led by women of color and veterans, was granted real disciplinary power. The justice system had not only responded, it had shifted. As for Colonel Brooks, she declined every offer to write a memoir or sign a movie deal. That wasn't why she stood her ground. Instead, she returned to her post with quiet dignity, refusing to become a spectacle. She resumed her duties, but the Pentagon noticed a change, not in her performance, but in her presence. You couldn't walk the halls without hearing someone mention the Brooks Standard. It became a term, unspoken but understood, commanding without rage, firm without compromise, brave enough to demand better, even when standing alone. Months later, on Veterans Day, Amina was honored during a national broadcast. The president himself called her to the stage. In a world where silence is often survival, he said, Colonel Brooks chose courage. Not with a weapon, not with a war cry, but with a phone call and a spine made of steel. The applause was thunderous, but Amina didn't smile for the cameras. Instead, her eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on a young black cadet in uniform, saluting from the front row. She returned the gesture with a nod, quiet, knowing. After the ceremony, she visited the same corner cafe where it all began. No security detail, no cameras, just her, a coffee, and a small, handwritten note pinned to the bulletin board near the counter. It read, "To the woman who stood tall so the rest of us didn't have to kneel alone. Thank you." She touched the note gently, her throat tight. It was never about revenge. It was always about respect. And now at long last, it felt like something had shifted. Not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or unjustly profiled. Because justice didn't just come in courtrooms or speeches. Sometimes it came from standing still while the world finally caught up. 5 years later, the story of Colonel Amina Brooks had become more than just a case study. It was a cornerstone of modern justice reform. Her name now adorned a lecture hall at West Point, where cadets studied her encounter not as a moment of anger, but of principle. She never sought to be a symbol, yet symbols, like leaders, are chosen by those who need them. On the anniversary of that fateful day, Amina returned quietly to that same Washington, D.C. street. The sun cast long shadows and the coffee shop still stood, now renamed Brooks and Honor Cafe. Inside, a photo of her, poised, uncuffed, unbroken, hung behind the counter. As she stepped outside, a teenage girl on a school field trip recognized her. "Are you the colonel they tried to arrest?" Amina smiled. "I'm the one who wouldn't let them forget it." The girl grinned wide, inspired, and Amina walked on, her heels tapping softly against the pavement that had once tried to shame her. But the street no longer whispered injustice. It echoed change, the kind born from dignity, not rage. Because some fights you don't win with force, you win them by refusing to kneel. True strength isn't about how loud you speak. It's about how firmly you stand. Colonel Amina Brooks didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight back with fists or fury. She stood in the face of injustice with unwavering dignity, using her voice, her training, and her integrity to demand what was right. This story reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a calm voice saying, "You were wrong." It's a refusal to be silenced, even when others try to define your worth by your appearance. You don't need a uniform to command respect. You don't need a title to deserve fairness, and you don't need permission to demand justice. Whether you're a soldier, a student, or just someone trying to get through the day, your voice matters. Stand tall in who you are. Speak when it's uncomfortable. Hold the line when the world expects you to fold. Because when you lead with dignity and truth, you don't just change your story, you change the system.